This was research that looked at organizational culture and organizational conflict, and the overall impact that these had on organizational performance. So the main questions were, what are the relationship, organizational and conflict, and does organizational culture have the ability to impact organizational performance, and what role does conflict play in that? So to evaluate this, they chose 18 companies in India that were selected at random, based on a basic set of criteria, that they had, roughly the same number of employees and things like that. So they had the company split up the participants in 3 categories. So there was a junior management team, which is essentially entry level, functional managers, mid-level, and senior managers, which would be leadership. And there were a total of 270 employees overall. 180 were taken from Technopark, which is where they had 12 companies from, and 90 employees from outside Technopark that were part of another 6 companies. All participants were provided a questionnaire regarding their organizational culture and conflict, and their responses were based on a 5-point Likert scale. So the results show that the majority of all respondents, regardless of job category, felt that a strong organizational culture would ultimately have lower organizational conflict. It should be noted that those who had the highest agreement with this were senior managers, and that decreased a little bit for both of the other groups. So still the majority, but was less than it was with managers. I think for the entry level, it was down to like 48%. So the results show that organizational culture and conflict are certainly related to one another, and organizational performance is affected by that relationship, which they determined to be that if organizational culture does decrease conflict, it should also lead to an improvement in performance, is what they were going with. So primarily the authors determined that some conflict in an organization is necessary and helps attain peak performance, whereas too much or too little can have a negative impact on the organization. So it's interesting that they also actually recommend that if there's too low of a conflict in an organization, that it can be stagnant, and how to prompt some level of conflict in a healthy way to take things in a different direction. So they determined, though, that conflict is unavoidable, but it can be beneficial if it's at a reasonable level, and in a way that can help produce innovation or new ideas. Too much or too little conflict can have negative outcomes for an organization, primarily in the workforce and with employees. So this is especially true when too much conflict creates a tense or stressful work environment and may contribute to turnover or lack of engagement. A strong and overall positive organizational culture can play a large role in keeping conflict in check and can lead to higher performance. It also generally leads to happier and more engaged employees.
I think, yeah, I think this is an interesting study. I feel like it's very, it's kind of like a case study in some ways, looking at, your junior managers and your senior managers. And it's interesting that the senior, I feel like the senior managers agreed with that kind of statement of strong organizational culture would ultimately have lower organizational conflict. And I wonder if it's like almost like being an advocate for, because I would imagine senior managers are probably older and they've been there a little bit longer. And so I think it's just interesting that they would have a stronger attachment to that than maybe some of the junior management or other managers.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting, and that's why I wanted to note it, because I wonder what the various implications are behind that. You're right. I think maybe it could be the length of time that they've been there. I also wondered how much of it was the possible communication issues, right? Maybe leadership feels that this really is effective, but as it trickles down, they don't feel either that same sense of attachment to the culture, or it's not as prominent, or, so I wondered about that too.
What I really like about kind of what these results and the takeaways are is the notion about too little conflict having a negative outcome for the organization. I think we see that in a lot of our work, where people are, I feel like we just recently had a conversation about this, about, people being very hesitant to say that we have conflict. like, because it's, it has such a negative connotation to it. So they're like, no, we don't have any conflict, but yet this is kind of shining light on the opportunity and like the catalyst for change that conflict can be. So it's kind of saying, well, if you don't have any conflict, it's not really doing your company or your organization the best that it could, like it not doing it well. So I like that this kind of adds a little twist to that, because I do think that it's important for a lot of leaders and just employees, people in the workforce out there, to know that that there's stagnation and like complacency is also not something that you really want in a company to thrive.
Yeah, I found that very interesting too. And they had a chart that was helpful that was based on research. And I'd have to go back if it was specific to this study or if it was pulling from other studies, but their chart like an overarching line. And so they show, at too low and too high is almost the same effect, where you on the overall performance. And then that there's this, it steadily goes up until it goes back down again. So I think that was an interesting point too. And you're right, I don't think it's talked about. And you hear so much about conflict when it's too high, when there's too much conflict, what those negative impacts are. But right, well, what about when it's too low? It's really not talked about as much.
Yeah, and I think it's just important for people to reframe the way that we view it, right? So that we're not so hesitant to acknowledge that we have conflict, or be open to saying that we, just be open to conflict. Instead, it's like, nope, we don't have it. We don't want it. Yeah, it's like a double-edged sword. I don't know.
I feel like it's almost that people who say they don't have conflict or they don't want conflict are either unconsciously or consciously like have avoidant behaviors towards it. And so it's just very much like you just, and then that's kind of that's the natural, I think, disposition for a lot of people just in general with conflict, because it can lead to negative outcomes if it's not handled well. And so it makes sense why it would be avoided, but the avoiding it a lot of times just pushes the problem until later, especially when you have, like, I don't know, I feel like I've seen this with a number of companies that we've worked with and talked about, and then just in interpersonal relationships that you decide just to kind of ignore the conflict or just avoid it, and it comes up to bite you in the end, because it doesn't really go away. It's still there. And so like the too little conflicts makes me think almost like you do need conflicts, but you need to not avoid conflicts. You need to deal with it,
Yeah, you're right. I mean, you're right. There's a big difference there between having it and avoiding it, or refusing to admit kind of thing that you have, that it exists, and actually not having any. So like, I think how I'm trying to correlate those two is people reading this to give, like, reading this article or these takeaways to then maybe shift the way that they're viewing it, and maybe, okay, maybe I don't have to avoid it or refuse to kind of admit. But Natalie, I'm curious, what were their ways of constructively increasing conflict in order to kind of negate the complacency or negative effects?
Yeah, so they didn't go into detail. They talk about how it's necessary and why it can be a bad thing, and that there should be ways to coach people on how to prompt it, but they didn't go into the specifics of how they do that. But I think that is worth looking into, and I'm sure, based on the way they wrote this, that they probably have some other research related to this. So I'd be curious to see the author's database and see if they have anything else that does show a little bit more what they're looking at. But I'll try to find it.
I wonder if it has anything to do with the personnel that they have and you know, like lack of diversity, not just in not in you know, external identities or anything like that, but just different educational levels or different, you know, expertise within an organization. Maybe that could be related to the, you know, having too little conflict, or people that have no new employees, or you know, people that have been there for so long, so there's not much like change and growth happening.
Actually, I did, sorry, so I pulled back up the article, and there is a very small little section at the end where they do talk about ways to stimulate conflict. And so it looks like they want to encourage individualistic thinking, enhance individual competition, provide information such as reduction in profit loss of a competitive edge in the market, create role conflict, and change organizational structure. So it sounds like some level of that is rooted in encouraging people to be comfortable and take risk, which maybe they were not able to do before.
So they're encouraging people to challenge the norms. I think that's an important. I mean, like, not being a conflict avoidant culture, but I think like what Sarah's saying is like helping companies helping people reframe the way they think about conflict is like, hey, conflict can be good. We want challenges. We want friction. We want that because that's where innovation happens. But what we don't want is destructive conflict, interpersonal stressful conflict, that kind of stuff. And so there's some amount of conflict in some realm that's like healthy, but then there's conflict that if it's just like avoided or it's let to go on and it becomes unhealthy. You ever see this? Yeah, anybody know the Yerkes-Dodson law of optimal stress arousal, optimal arousal? It's like it talks about stress arousal, stress response and the optimal arousal levels, and it's like basically it's like this idea that it's on a bell curve that too little stress is not good for someone if it's, you know, unmotivated or whatever, and then too much stress is obviously unhealthy as well. But there's this like middle ground that's an optimal level of arousal to make people feel, well, you know, motivated and challenged in like a healthy way. It seems like that same thing. This study kind of speaks to the same kind of bell curve, in that there needs to be some optimal level of conflict. Maybe we should have our own law. You know? Optimal conflict level.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think about this, Jeremy. I know you use kind of the basic psychological needs approach to analyzing conflict, and the growth and stimulation, I feel like those are indicators of, you know, without having conflict, like having too little conflict, you're not getting that growth and stimulation. Right. So it's like you need that to and obviously techniques and tools to constructively work through conflict in order to reach growth and stimulation. But with, like, as this article is depicting, you know, too little conflict, you're not going to get that growth and stimulation.
Yeah, it'd be a good, you know, it'd be an interesting like program to try to market, of just saying like we're gonna teach your culture that conflict can be a good thing. We're gonna reframe conflict as a culture and help and, you know, bring out some of the stuff that's going to continue to keep you innovative. That would be interesting.
Be a whole new workshop.
Whole new workshop.
Yeah.